right, welcome to the Public Safety Coordinating Council meeting. Let's go around the room and do introductions. My name is Kiki Rose, and I am the Jackson County Justice Director.
And I'm Robert Johnson, Executive Director of Community Groups.
Mike Benson, state police.
TJ Graham,
Rick Dyer, County Commissioner.
Danny Jordan, Jackson County.
Stacey Brubaker, Department Director for Jackson County Health and Human Services.
Clint O'Warren, Public Defender.
Patrick Green, District Attorney's Office. Here for Beth, she's in Germany, so you guys are stuck.
I'm Travis Christian, Vice President of Direct Construction.
Nate Sickler, Sheriff.
Josh Aldrich, Shield Commander.
Bobby Devine, Deputy Director at the Transition Center.
Joe Ferguson, Deputy Director for Juvenile Services.
Ryan Butler, Grants Contract Manager for Community Justice.
Mike Larson, City Central Blank, City Council.
Okay, and Darcy, you want to call roll for those on Zoom? Dr. Carter?
Dave Carter, SOU Citizen Member.
Rita Sullivan?
Rita Sullivan, Psychologist, Citizen Member.
Tina Claus?
Tina Claus, Child Court Administrator.
Judge Bloom?
Ben Bloom, Presiding Judge, Circuit Court.
And Jennifer?
Jennifer Milenick, CASA of Jackson and Justine County.
Great. Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming. The first item on the agenda is to go through and approve the minutes from the last meeting. Those were sent out. Does anyone want to make a motion?
Move, Rose.
Second.
Motion second. Are there any changes to those minutes? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Motion carries. We're going to change the agenda just a little bit today. We're going to have the Sheriff's Office provide their presentation, and then if we have time, we do an additional presentation on Justice Reinvestment.
So really, we wanted to give the background on what's going on with this so-called McShane order. If you're not familiar, it's a case that started in Washington County. We'll go into kind of the history of it, which created a ruling about how long people could stay in custody specifically without being assigned representation. So indigent folks who are in jail have not yet been assigned a public defender, and there was a lawsuit surrounding that. Like the sheriff says, just yesterday afternoon, they stayed the ultimate opinion and order until February. So a lot of what we tell you, nothing that we tell you is actually in place now, other than the fact that most of the counties are actually deciding how to implement it in their jurisdictions. So it all started with this Bedchart versus Garrett, that's Sheriff Garrett out of Washington County. That was a lawsuit that came. It was brought forth by one of the federal public defender's offices, and it really initially grouped together as one class all of the people who were unrepresented and who had been charged with a crime. So that was both people who were in Washington County's jail and who had been released under some sort of release considerations prior to having an opportunity to be adjudicated and to be assigned a public defender. At the time of the lawsuit, this is the number that they estimated here. 164 people were in custody in Washington County, statewide, and just under 2,500 people who they estimated were out of custody statewide, but with release conditions. And what was important about the release condition piece of it is that some of the conditions were pretty restrictive to people's movement. So again, without any representation, these are people that had been assigned to like home detention. There were things that were really restricting their lives that were put in place without ever had an opportunity to talk to representation about it. You just jumped.
It was beyond the the normal don't leave the state and must appear for court, which are all standard stipulations for somebody who's released. It was beyond those in some cases, in a lot of the cases. And then I think it's important to note the original filing or the suit wanted anybody who had been charged with any crime who didn't have representation within 48 hours of arraignment to have the charges dismissed. So that was a pretty extreme, I think, approach by the public defender's office. And so when we get to where we are now and we kind of explain where things would have been had the order not been stayed, you can kind of see where it started as this really extreme thing and kind of landed somewhere where, I mean, if you really look at it, people probably should be afforded representation if they're charged with crimes, especially people who are in custody, right? I mean, and there's some pretty egregious cases in here we'll talk about, or at least examples.
Yeah, in the initial suit, they actually went through and discussed some very specific examples of people who had been in custody. They were folks who had been in custody for, anything from like 20 days. So they talked about people who were in their 200th day of custody or further who were without representation. Now, in some of those cases, they had at one point been assigned an attorney, and for one reason or another, they no longer had one. But it really kind of went into detail about some of these cases. And the real focus was on the 6th and 14th Amendment violations. So what those are for everybody. The 6th Amendment, essentially the portion of this that applies, really just says that you have a fundamental right. The accused has a fundamental right in the aid of counsel in any criminal prosecution. The 14th Amendment portion that applies prohibits the government from physically detaining citizens prior to trial unless certain procedural safeguards are met, such as providing counsel at an adversarial hearing. Due process and equal protection standards also prohibit our government from discriminating against the poor in providing access to governmental rights. And so there's a lot of language in that suit that talks about how, really the only reason that people are in this circumstance is because they don't have the means to afford an attorney. And so really, they kind of tried to drive home the portion of this process that was keeping people from having representation because they were poor. In that initial suit, they also had some statements that had been made by judges. So this is one Washington County judge who, when asked by a defendant when he would get an attorney, this was a direct quote in the suit. He says, "I don't know. You won't get a disagreement from me or from the prosecutor that you should have a lawyer. It's an unfortunate circumstance that we have here within our state." And so they really kind of had the evidence to pound home the fact that there was a problem in the state. It was never even disputed by anybody within the suit that there was a problem. And so what they were seeking at this time was a temporary restraining order, and they'd ask again for these two portions to be lumped together. They'd ask for the people who were not in custody and the people who were in custody. After some initial arguments by Sheriff Garrett and his team in Washington County, Judge McShane, so he's the federal judge that was overseeing this suit, he believed that it was two completely separate and distinct groups that we should talk about because of kind of the loss and the timeliness required for the people who were in custody and out of custody. So he split those into two. He at that point completely set aside any decision for those out of custody people. He did put some pieces in that initial temporary restraining order that addressed them. Really, those were about the fact that people should be released with conditions in place. If those conditions were violated, then they could be rearrested for those sort of things. But he made it very clear that there should be conditions. But really, ultimately, the initial decision and later the ultimate opinion focused on those people who were in custody. And so this is his initial decision about the temporary restraining order. So everything I put up here is language directly from that initial decision. Now we're talking July. This all happened in July for time reference. And so I'm not going to read all of the things I put up there. I'll give you guys a little bit of time to read it. But really what he said was, it's clear that we have here things that would win in any challenge to the civil rights violation pieces. And in doing that, we need to make a decision about those people who are specifically in custody, about how they either get representation in a timely manner or they're not held in custody any further. Again, he made it very clear that group that was no longer in custody needed to be separated out. But again, like those bottom bullet points, he's saying that there's an absolute harm that's being done to these folks who are in custody by not having representation. And many of these people, again, in the suit, they had documented that they'd been to several hearings in front of judges. I think one of them, there was a discussion, and I don't know about the veracity of all the claims made in the suit, but there was one where there was a discussion where the judge ultimately had said to the person, like, look, we can plea you out right now. You can be done with your time in jail. We're not going to be able to assign you an attorney. So, if you want to wait for an attorney, we can keep you in jail longer. But if you want to get rid of this, we just need to get rid of it now, right? And so, again, I don't think that stuff was ever necessarily vetted for complete. And Clint, Patrick, and Judge Bloom, if you guys have input at all, please jump in. But it was clear that there was a problem, I guess is the point, right? And so he made the order, and this was the initial order. So again, this goes back to July. This was only in Washington County. Now, I should say that after the initial suit was filed against Sheriff Garrett in Washington County, they added the Washington County judges. So the circuit court judges on the bench in Washington County were added to that suit. And so this is what the temporary restraining order put in place back in July. It basically said that after the first appearance by an in-custody defendant who was found to be indigent and had all the qualifying circumstances for a public defender, that if they were not assigned a public defender or representation of some kind within 10 days, then they had to be released from custody. And that in that release, they had these conditions that had to be set forth. And, if they violated those, they could be arrested, like we said before. But it was pretty clear in Washington County that this was going to be the standard. And that temporary restraining order was set to go into place on August 27th. That was the day of the initial. Is that right? Did I put? It was either July or August.
I think you said July. I think August is right, yeah.
And so that really started this statewide conversation. We were all aware that these things were happening in Washington County. We knew that Washington County had been picked, but really it was kind of a statewide problem. And so when that went into place in Washington County, you got anything you want to jump in there at all about that part? Everybody statewide, in the groups that I'm part of, and I know locally in Jackson County, we all started talking about how this would impact our own jurisdictions. In Jackson County at the time, I think there was a list, and I want to say that list was somewhere around 30 people who had been in custody who were either past the 10 days or very close to it at that time. You guys all know the state of who's held in the Jackson County Jail. So these weren't necessarily just people who were looking at things like trespass charges. Some of them had fairly significant charges.
Yeah, no, and go ahead. I was just going to, at the end, we'll talk about the example they used when they sued us, which will tie into that.
So we met with the judges, we met with the district attorney's office and the public defender's office, and we all kind of figured out how this would work out if we had to release people under these conditions. Again, the Washington County order really had no authority over Jackson County, but I think everybody knew that the state should fall into line in somehow showing that we were making an effort to protect the people who were unrepresented. At the time, the judges here in Jackson County decided that we were going to be able to make some progress in at least getting the most severe of the crimes who were in custody assigned a defense attorney. And so we were not going to release people just under the 10-day conditions. What we did see in our courts is we started to see people being released who maybe would have otherwise been held, but they were through judicial release orders that was happening. We didn't have to kick anybody out just because they came up against the 10 days. And so that's sort of how we operated for, September, basically. Towards the beginning of October, we started to hear, and actually we kind of heard it through the rumor mill, that these suits were going to start expanding to other counties and that our county would be one of them. And so that brings me to this part of the Tulio versus this guy right here. Again, that same federal public defender filed a suit in Jackson County against us. I'll let the sheriff talk about this one.
Yeah, so I had the benefit of being named in a lawsuit over something that I don't necessarily have any control of how things go, which is interesting. I thought, man, that's just really odd. They're going to sue me, but then you look at the system, and of course the jail is kind of the linchpin, right? We run the jail. If somebody's in jail and people believe that their rights are being violated, you sue the person that can push the green button to let them out, not necessarily who's responsible for the dysfunction of the public defender's office or whatever else is going on in the courts. So I get it, wasn't happy about it, but our county legal did a great job of responding. And it was interesting because Josh said, we don't have a lot of people languishing in our jail over real minor offenses as people like to talk about in some instances across the country where somebody has a parking fine, for instance, they fail to pay their fine and then they go to jail for a week or two, lose their job, and so on and so forth. We don't have that here. And if you want to, So the differences in the history of the petitioner. So when they picked two examples out of our county, the first, Julio, had several fail to appear. So he, in essence, would have violated release agreements. And his previously assigned attorney, so he was given representation, withdrew because he failed to appear and dropped out of contact with his attorney for 6 months. So it wasn't that he didn't get a shot at representation, it's that he defaulted on his basically release agreements and everything else. And this is the example that they used as why we should be, or I should be sued. And then the second guy, Navarrete, he had allegedly committed new crimes. Now I say allegedly committed because he hadn't been convicted of anything, but he was released from jail in regards to an assault of a third degree assault, which is a felony assault of a child. Now that could be a minor, but it doesn't necessarily mean like a little kid, but in the eyes of the law, a minor. And he was released from custody, and 2 months later, he was indicted on assault for domestic type charges. So not great examples of when you have to balance the interest of public safety and constitutional rights, as far as, clearly these two had demonstrated that they were not or were kind of a threat to the community safety as a whole or to others, individuals' liberties. So it was interesting that these individuals were picked for this argument. At the end of the day, I don't think that mattered much. We can move forward. We got, a new order came out and was set to go into effect on November 23rd. And it basically said that it went from 10 days to 7 days was the change for people who were in custody. So it was 7 days from arraignment. If you were in custody and did not have an attorney, you were to be released from jail. That was the result of the second tier of arguments, which our county was involved with. You want to go through that order a bit?
Yeah, so this overrode the temporary restraining orders. This became the permanent order and opinion. And the biggest change from the temporary restraining order process and the order of opinion is that they included all of the state of Oregon. So now this did establish governance for all of us and what we're doing within the jails. And if you are kind of a law nerd like I am, it's actually a really good order to read. Like all 32 pages are full of pretty interesting information and specific cases about people who were in custody. And again, they even go into some further detail about kind of length of custodial stays for people, some specifics again about, what happened to them in their different hearings and how Judge McShane got to this order. But yeah, it again just focuses on the in custody piece. He says right up front, like maybe it's page 2, that Judge McShane says, we need some systematic changes in legislative resolve within our state to help this, right? He doesn't make it sound like it's going to be a quick process, but he's basically saying, like, we need to highlight what's going on. We have to give people their constitutional protections. There's really no explanation that I remember seeing as to why they went from 10 to 7 days, other than that the suit continued to ask, they continued to ask for this 48-hour process, shorten and shorten and shorten. So maybe that was just a midpoint for him. And then he did talk about, and in the initial opinion, it wasn't clear how this process would work, but from my understanding, they clarified in some later conversation. But he did talk about that this 7 days also applies to people who previously had representation, but then lost that for some reason. And so I think there was some concern with a few of us that defendants in custody could kind of play this fire their attorney game and would continue to reset the 7 days. And what was clarified was that this had to require a piece of kind of a judicial decision-making piece, right? So you guys correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it wasn't simply that a defendant could fire their attorney and restart the 7 days hoping to get released. It required the judge to decide that there was some cause, reason to create that separation. Am I saying that right?
Essentially conflict of interest, like basically through no fault of theirs.
Yeah. So it clarified that piece. And then he really dug into this balance of the kind of equitable treatment versus public interest. And I thought it was interesting. I think I did pull this language specifically right out of his opinion, but he says, while the release of certain pretrial defendants into the community may cause legitimate concern about community safety, that theoretical fear does not mean that we should suspend the Constitution as our response. The public's interest in the rule of law and the protection of our fundamental rights is at the heart of our democracy. With every right, there's a measure of risk. The one crime that was excluded from this mandatory release, I guess 2 crimes, but the murder crimes were excluded from the mandatory release portion. There's statute that governs the fact that those folks will not be released, and so it didn't override those statutes.
Initially, there was thought that could happen, right? When this was first being talked about, there was this thought that, hey, even if you were charged with murder, that you could be released within the 7 or 10 days if you didn't have an attorney assigned. And you can think about where it went from the 10 days to 7 days, and we don't know that exactly, but there was people who were in custody in jail for, I believe, up to 269 days at one point without representation. That's pretty egregious. There was 31 defendants who had been waiting for a year to be assigned counsel. Now, these were out of custody individuals, right? These were on the release with conditions. But that seems like a really long time to have your case belabored. You know, if it's not that important, then what are we doing? And it seems like to me, you know, when I read the opinion and you read the other information, and you know, I hate to cast blame, but it really feels like part of the judicial system fell asleep at the wheel up there in Washington County. Judges were aware that people didn't have attorneys. Other people involved were aware they didn't have attorneys, but yet nobody was doing anything to correct or remedy the problem. And therefore, the judge came in and remedied it for us in a way that maybe not as potentially, it could be harmful to the community if it goes into effect in its current order. And I say that, you know, murder and ag murder, but there are a lot of charges out there that could be problematic that don't fall into those 2 categories. That could be a real problem for the community if they were released, you know, from jail without significant oversight. So, you know, we'll see. Hopefully that'll get all remedied, and hopefully we'll be able to fix this scenario. We have a few months, but I think there's we'll talk about more of a systemic issue with just resources to do so.
Again, everything was fixed. So the day that this was supposed to go into effect was actually Thanksgiving Day. That was going to be the first release. We had lots of questions here in Jackson County about how it was going to work. So one thing is that most jails in the state, and I've confirmed with the other jail commanders, it's not just us, but we don't track who has an attorney assigned. It's really not part of our process. You know, our role is to be supportive of the court system. We hold people in custody. We don't know when somebody has an attorney or not. And so we started to work through some solves for that piece. And basically what that came down to was that the courts would share a daily list of who's been in custody for any amount of time and who was not assigned. Matter of fact, they had an out of custody list too that they were sharing. And so we're all involved in that list, the public defender's office, district attorney's office, the courts, and the jail. And I will tell you that when that list first was developed, this was when we were kind of in our 2-week waiting period, there were some crimes on that list that we would potentially have had to release that were pretty alarming. And so again, I think it goes to the district attorney's office and working on prioritizing which of those folks was assigned representation, so that we made sure that, you know, we didn't want to shock the community in having to release somebody who had a serious sex offense charge, for example, right? And so they started working through that. On November 21st, so what is that, a couple days back, that was the number of people who would have been in our jail and released with the 7 days or more. There are questions that I think still need to be answered between now and the time that an ultimate order maybe goes into effect. So there are people who are allowed representation, like, for instance, people who are on fugitive charges from other states. And so, you know, how's that work if we can't get a public defender to them, but technically they're being held for extradition to another place? And so we have to answer some kind of little nuanced type questions about that. Another one that came up was, what if your 7 days falls on a Sunday following a holiday, when should that release take place? Are we going to be releasing people on day 4 because Thursday and Friday are court holidays, and then you go into your weekend? And so trying to answer some things like that. But our hope, and I think I've said it publicly as many times as possible, our hope always within the jail is to not have to make the decision to release people who have at least been alleged to commit violent crimes in our community already. And so we're hoping that we can continue to work together with the courts and make sure that the right people are prioritized in that. I think this was your note.
For us, because I'm the one who's listed as the respondent in the suit, obviously we're going to have to create some pathways to find out who is and who isn't represented. So that could cause resource use in our jail differently, because I would be the one on the hook for potentially violating that order. So we'll have to ensure that there's a path of communication. We work really good with the courts and the DA's office now and the public defender's office. So I don't think it'll be a huge issue, but at the end of the day, we are going to have to make sure that I'm not the one that's violating this order.
And I think that's one of the best things we have going for us in this community, and it's not this way statewide, is like, we don't have an adversarial relationship with the public defender's office. The district attorney's office and the public defender's office can communicate with each other. That's okay. So on that note, we thought it'd be important for Clint to be able to talk about how those appointments work. And so we kind of put a slide in here for him.
Ultimately, just a couple of things. First, so in regards to Tulio and Navarrete, like in regards to, the class. So when you're picking a class, you usually try and pick the best people out of the class. Well, we're the reason that they didn't have a good class to sue you with, because we'd taken up those cases that were the good class of people that they could sue you with. Appreciate that. In fact, anyways, multiple times there's a number of people that we take them off the list and they were going to be part of the lawsuit. So, yeah. So that's why you end up with people who are like, oh, they've been represented before and all those kinds of things. So there are other people that was not the case, that were in custody otherwise, but we were able to absorb those cases. So ultimately, with this order, there's always a ton of different meetings and that, trying to make determinations of how we're going to deal with this McShane order. And so we had a number of meetings end of August, or 1st September, and then with the new order coming out as well. And so I kind of went over this before, but we have a priority in how we assign cases. And so basically the priority we're looking at changing was we're going to have to examine it every 7 days, whereas normally we've been doing it about 3 times a month, just to get appointments. And so the cases, we are prioritizing the serious cases that are in custody. Obviously, those are the ones, which is why we take people away from your class of people that might have the suits. And so there's a lot of things, though, that priorities that get balanced out, combination of them. So ultimately, attorneys can only take so many cases, like we talked about, in order to this is really a constitutional crisis. I think it was mentioned multiple times. It's a public defense crisis. It's a constitutional crisis. It's the Constitution. It's really an issue here. And so how's that affecting individuals that are actually being represented? And so attorneys can only take so many cases. So we're taking in custody cases, though, out of priority, but certain attorneys can't take higher level cases. We've talked about that before. And so only, a new graduate out of law school is not going to be taking a murder case for obvious reasons, or a rape case or something along those lines. And so it's got to be what you're qualified to take first. And so they're filling up basically caseloads each month with very serious cases. So our attorneys that can handle serious cases basically have nothing but serious cases going on. And then if those same individuals get other charges, then they'll also be appointed on those cases, because those are going to be tertiary to the primary case they're dealing with. And so from our perspective, charges too, though, also are not always the best indicator of public safety concern. For example, someone, I think it was mentioned, someone charged with assault of a minor, that can come in. Different charges can have different kinds of victims, but be the same charges. And so when we get the appointment process, it's not done based on what were the exact specific circumstances of this case, because that's just too administratively laborious to be able to figure that out. It comes in as these are the charges coming in. So you may have maybe a rape case that came out of a drunken party at SOU that's going to be given the same public safety concern as a rape case of someone molesting little children. And so there's different things that way that obviously come into taking what's a bigger public safety concern. And so ultimately it's hard where we don't get to choose that way. And if people get full up on their cases each month, it could be that one or the other, one might take priority over there, which could obviously be a problem, but that will be unrecognized until the case is picked up, police reports are received, and those things. And then the other thing about this is the out of custody list is going to continue to grow, particularly if priority is given to nothing but in custody. And so the out of custody list currently, I believe, is up to, I think May is some of the oldest unrepresented people sitting out there. So we're not a year out for the unrepresented, I think, as mentioned in the suit, but we do have 6 months out that we're looking at now at this point. So, and that I think is likely to grow if, particularly with priority being given to in custody defendants. And the priority behind that, the idea behind that is there's basically two interests that kind of separate these classes. One is if you're out of custody, you've got a due process interest that's being violated. And if you're in custody, you also have a due process interest that's being violated. But if you're in custody, not only do you have a due process issue, you've also got a liberty issue, like your liberty is being infringed upon on being lodged and being incarcerated at the time. So anyways, there's a lot of things that come into this, but ultimately the plan is, if moving forward prior to this stay till February, which there will obviously be some ruling in February that will affect all of us and how that proceeds forward. Plan was basically to kind of evaluate this on a week-to-week basis so we could take in the most serious cases as they come along. And that's still kind of some of the strategy. We do that at the beginning of each month anyways, and we'll be taking them as they come along. And the intent is to hopefully be able to take serious Measure 11 crimes and that as they come in immediately on custody. But it depends on how many Measure 11 crimes are charged each month and what comes through and the capacity of attorneys to take those. This last month in November, we've taken almost all the Measure 11 crimes, but I think there's one or two that are sitting out there, including one that Mr. Green and I are trying to make sure gets an attorney on the case so we can get that moving along. And so there's one that definitely public safety concerns that way. And so, but currently they are not technically on that list because they've not filled out the paperwork to have an attorney. And so anyways, there are people though there that could be of concern that potentially could face release depending on what the final outcome of the order is. So that's about all I have to add.
All right. Thanks, sir. Did you want to add anything, Patrick?
Yeah, I think I'll just add to this bullet point. I think I would not just say that all Measure 11s are not equal. I'd say all felonies are not equal. And so sometimes, especially with domestic violence or child abuse, you can have a C felony that's not a Measure 11 crime be more serious than a Measure 11 case. So, for instance, a bar fight where somebody used a pool stick to hit someone during it. So, I love that the change that we're going to try to make, that the public defenders are going to try to take Measure 11 cases. But I think it's just the advantage we have in this county is that we have a good relationship. And so when we identify cases, if they're, C felonies where we think there needs to be an attorney on that case to prevent somebody from getting released, I know we can have those conversations and hopefully prioritize that case to be taken before we run into the timeline. So we've had a lack of jail space in this county for quite some time, which means if you stay lodged in the Jackson County Jail longer than a week, you're probably in on a pretty serious charge, or your criminal history is so bad that we want to keep you in. So that's the challenge we're facing in our county, just because we also have a big unrepresented problem here. We rival other counties with the numbers. So
I think we're actually, are we 2 or 1 now? I know we were 2 behind Oklahoma.
Yes.
So we had overall, we were the second highest of unrepresented defendants, and it was just behind Oklahoma. I think we might even, I don't know if we passed it, but it was, we're really close. You can look on
trying to
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Internet's big.
And I think just to add black, because I always take a plug for jail space when I can, so I have to go in the door. But the lack of jail space, I think, contributes to part of this problem, exacerbates it, because you have defendants out there getting case after case after case when they should probably be in custody. And that adds more work to the public defenders, more work to the DA's office, and hence more victims in the community. And there's, they don't get dealt with until they get way high up on the list for being a problem. So.
Yeah, and we, Beth and I continue to have conversations with the court, continue to have conversations within our office, with the public defense consortiums, Clint and everybody else, to try to find creative solutions. We're trying to find, for the underlying issue, not McShane's order, but the unrepresented crisis, to kind of start chipping away at that backlog of cases that doesn't seem to go down. So we're trying different things. We're trying to think outside the box, and hopefully we'll be able to alleviate some of the pressure, which hopefully by February, it will help this when whatever order goes into effect, because there is going to be some kind of order, whatever timeline they put on it, whether it be 7, 10, or 14, or 21 days. So there will be something in February. So we're working on it.
All right. Yeah, so all of that being said, we don't really know what's happening. I guess what I didn't say is that stay is to appeal it to the Ninth Circuit, so that's happening. That's where the timeline came from. We're still trying to work in Jackson County. I think there's also a statewide response team that's been put together. I haven't heard really what's happening with that, but they were based from the Douglas County area to try to go help out throughout the state where people were unrepresented.
That should start in January is what I heard, and I think they're going to help the most here. So they're going to be based in Douglas County, because apparently office space was cheaper in Douglas County. But they're mostly going to be helping here because we have such a big problem. So also that will help the order getting delayed until February, whatever form it takes then. Hopefully that will be up and running, and then we'll be able to make sure we absorb all the watch cases.
Does anybody have any questions about what's happened to this point that maybe we can collectively answer?
I was just curious whether there's actually been conversation about what they think the proposed legislative fixes will even be.
I've not heard of anything specifically coming from the federal judge's office. I think it's all conversation on a local and statewide level between district attorneys and public defenders' offices.
And I can add a little bit, because I sat through some hearings, so the legislative body, and I can't remember which work group it was, but it was the same one that was listening to testimony on 10 and other things. They talk a lot about the public defender shortage crisis. And so there was a lot of different ideas thrown out there from the state task force. There's giving additional funding, bringing up pay. I mean, there's just a lot of ideas. There's been nothing that's been like, this is what's going to happen legislatively, but they're listening to testimony from various entities trying to come up with a plan.
Fortunately, most of them are long term. So really the quick fixes are the band-aids that we come up locally. So, the strike team that's going to have offices around the state, they're going to be state employed public defenders that are going to help out where the biggest problems are. That is a legislative fix to kind of fix it in the short term and just kind of bridge until we can change the system in the long term.
There was stuff brought up during the hearing about that, about where they would get these state-funded attorneys, which would probably come from local DAs, DA offices, or PD, well, whoever would pay more, honestly. But yeah, so there was testimony of both. And so, that was a concern if you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in essence. Would it help that much, or how do you confuse? And they talked about some recruiting efforts and some other things. So I don't know where that will go.
They're still in a hiring process for the well-compensated Justice League. So they have hired on the primary director of the strike force, the strike force for the Willamette area and the Southern Oregon area. and they're in the process of making the hires for basically the two places they're sitting out of Salem and out of Roseburg. And so the Roseburg will have 3 attorneys that are intended to cover 3 counties. Well, initially 3 counties: Douglas, Jackson, and Klamath. We are the most acute issue in regards to number of charged and unrepresented. So the idea is the priority here. They are station roadworks, so there will be issue is, of course, additional travel expenses then that are set aside for their state employees' travel. Do that. However, it's helpful for us locally that they are stationed in Roseburg, because then they are not picking from our local attorneys that are already taking cases. So that's kind of the good news, bad news of it, because their pay structure is much more than any public defender's office could ever compete with. And
40 case office.
yeah, they are.
Purple, Washington.
Yeah. So they're paid on the structure. Yeah, more of a structure, DOJ kind of pay structure, which DOJ doesn't really have the same human resources problem that most of all of us have. So for obvious reasons.
Jennifer?
I'm just curious about how much public awareness and therefore public pressure there is on this.
So I know that there has been a lot in the media lately. We've seen print, if that's really a thing anymore, online print articles coming out. There have been a couple cable news type stories that have been run.
I think McShane order brought attention to it. I mean, that's been a big thing. It's brought state and national attention to it. So.
And I think, Libby made a comment, they gave a statement early on, I think, to the RB Times, but then the order was in flux so much, it was hard to hey, let's go out and make a news story today, and then everything we talked about is now irrelevant. Like yesterday, we found out at 3 o'clock that this was going to effect. So I didn't do media requests purposely over the last week, knowing there was going to be up and downs and changes, because what's the point?
I think there's been a lot of media attention, or maybe not a lot of, but there has been media attention. I think it's hard for people to connect it to how it affects their daily lives, because they don't have the example of a serious case where somebody got released because of the issue. So there probably could be more media attention on individual cases where we have to release someone due to the crisis. So I think that's the missing part, and that's maybe why there isn't so much public scrutiny over it.
And for our county too, our community is desensitized to releasing people from jail. Really, we've been doing it for so long. Yeah, we're not going to typically release murderers or anything, or really serious Measure 11s, but as I said, there's some people that are released that are more problematic to the community at that time than some Measure 11s because of the circumstances of the crime. So we've been doing it for so long that they're going to be tough, unless you had some really outrageous examples to highlight.
I think I mentioned anecdotally before. People ask me how do you do what you do, but it doesn't really become an issue until it's hey, my brother, my sister, my uncle, and I'm oh wait, they're charged with this and they don't have an attorney. And then people are more oh, I get what you do. So I think that draws attention, anecdotally saying to individuals and people going, oh wait, this is an issue that they might not have recognized what it is until it's someone you know.
Well, I personally think there's a big misunderstanding about kind of what it requires for the indigency piece. We're not necessarily talking about people who are unhoused and have no means, right? It doesn't take long for somebody to become indigent when they're housed in our facility for a few weeks and they stop having the ability to take care of themselves financially. And so that's a piece that I hope can be discussed along with kind of the public perception part of it. Any other questions? Anybody on Zoom? Judge? Not up there anymore? Okay, all right. Well, we will fill you all in when we hear more. But, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, you guys. So the second part of our afternoon is to go over justice reinvestment. You've heard me talk about this now, I think twice before. I think I mentioned at the last meeting that the grant review committee who takes a look at our applications for that funding made a recommendation to only fund us provisionally for 1 year instead of funding us for 2 years biennially, and they gave a couple of reasons for that, so I thought I would go through that with you. We went ahead and put together a response and sent that to the Criminal Justice Commission commissioners who are going to be meeting tomorrow. And I intend to provide some testimony ahead of time just in support of them fully funding us for the full biennium. So I'm going to run through a couple of things as far as information, and then feel free to ask questions. So just as a reminder, what is the Justice Reinvestment Program and the goals? So the goals of the JRP are to reduce recidivism through evidence-based practices while protecting the public safety and holding individuals accountable, and decreasing prison utilization for property, drug, and driving offenses while protecting public safety and holding those individuals accountable. So part of the grant application was they wanted to fund community-based programs. In addition, there was 10% carved out for victim services, and then there's 3% that we could have applied for to have an evaluation done locally. We chose to give that 3% back because you can't really do a good evaluation with 3% of the funding. You may recall that when I presented before about the grant application, we reviewed that here on August 22nd of 23. We requested $1,387,818.20. That's because this is a formula grant and we get a certain percentage of the overall Justice Reinvestment Program funds. So that's an automatic amount given to us based on our population here. Victim Services gets 10% of that. So we requested, which historically Jackson County and every other county who has submitted requests for Justice Reinvestment Programming has done, biennial funding, 2 years of funding, because that's what the grant application process allows, and that's how long the funding cycle is. We requested to continue funding for the programs that we have listed there, which is the Pathfinder Network, our Voices of Lived Experience, Nathan Beard Job Development, our Transitional Care Program, which is our TC program, our residential program out at the Transition Center, and our Resource Center. And because we no longer are doing pretrial, that's what we had historically paid or used the Justice Reinvestment Program dollars for, was for the pretrial program. That was moved to the court, and the court will fully take that over on December 31st. We then requested creating a new program to try to fill some of the gap for those folks of people coming into the jail and getting out quickly without any resources. They're unhoused. They come in and go quickly, and so our plan was if we could place somebody there to help case manage those folks out, including providing medically assisted treatment, ongoing services, that we could try to reduce the number of people returning to custody before they could get through, or as they went through the justice process. The Grant Review Committee, this is their data and their information that I'm about to share with you. Before they met, they sent out to the full committee a list of folks that are currently utilizing less prison than, or staying below their baseline. Those people are listed in green. Those that are below baseline but are increasing their prison usage, and then those that are above baseline and increasing their prison usage. Clackamas, Jackson, and Polk fell in that category. This is just, again, that same data, just in a bar graph. You can see that Clackamas is much higher than we are. Jackson, and then Polk, which is a very small community, also has a high number based on baseline, but they have a very low percentage of the overall population. So after listening to the grant review committee go over our application, they decided to only recommend this provisional funding. This is the notice that we received. A lot of the reason that they only recommended provisional funding is because we did mention ballot measure 110 in our application process as something that is contributing to the number of drug driving and property crimes in our community. When we mentioned that, we didn't have the data submitted to them to support that. They also were looking, of course, at our 25% increase in prison usage since inception of the Justice Reinvestment Program. So we put together a response, and we did a huge dive into data, so thank you to everyone that we reached out to help us gather this data. Our team went through weeks and weeks of going through the data so that we could put together a response that we thought would be appropriate. And our response basically, after we reviewed all of our data, we were able to show that Justice Reinvestment Funding, just over the last 5 years, we took our last 5 years of data, has assisted over 12,000 clients and services and helped provide over 11,000 clients and services to victims within our community. That's a fairly high number. We saw property crime arrests decline in 2018 through 2020. This is based on UCR data. In 2021, property crime arrests began to increase in Jackson County while drug and driving cases decreased. That makes sense. Ballot measure 110 decriminalized drugs. It's natural that we would see that reduction, but we did continue to see this increase in property crimes. This data that we're showing you took out misdemeanor crimes, so it doesn't include like petty theft, shoplifting, or anything that we knew would come out as a violation or a misdemeanor, because we were trying to make it realistic data for a felony that would be involved in the UCR report. So during that same period, our supervised, those people coming to us, community justice, our supervised population has increased by 0.9%. The data collected through the Department of Corrections, OJD, and our Doc 400, which is our Department of Corrections program, shows that we diverted, in the last 5 years, 604 people, 863 cases from prison, and that's between 2018 and 2023, during that 5-year time period. During that time period, 129 people representing 198 cases that were previously diverted from prison were revoked. So we tried to make it equitable. Yes, we diverted them up front, but those that came to us on supervision and we ended up revoking, wanted to make it realistic data, because that's not a prison bed day savings. What we found was 13,729 months worth of savings can be attributed to Jackson County in diverting that number of people and cases into our community. The courts are putting them on probation as opposed to sending them to the institution. First sentences, meaning somebody in court goes directly from court to prison versus coming to probation first. So first sentence diversions to prison and probation revocations are all primarily high risk of individuals, which we've talked about here before. When we talk about high risk, we are looking at their criminal history as well as some other factors, and we're saying they're high risk to reoffend. And then we had very few low risks individuals revoked. Clint?
Is that, when you talk about the high risk, are those ones that probation officers are recommending revocation on, or ones that ultimately get revoked despite? Because we have things going on, right, where the probation office doesn't necessarily recommend revocation, but then ultimately the DA's office does, or the judge decides to revoke them. Is that data, or is it just data based off of what the probation officers are?
This data is based on the public safety checklist. Anybody has access to that in the state of Oregon. You can put somebody's SID number in on the Criminal Justice Commission website. Their risk level comes up. So
It's anybody who's revoked, though. It doesn't matter.
It counts at anyone revoked.
Thanks, Danny. Sorry. In an effort to reduce the usage, specifically length of stay, because they also said that our length of stay was higher than the rest of the counties, We brought back from prison early 199 folks. So we have a program in Oregon called short-term transitional leave. House Bill 3194 created this program where historically if you were in treatment in prison, you could come out 30 or 90 days early. It's now up to 6 months early. So we've been bringing people back from the institution 6 months early. That also contributes to a reduction of months in jail. So that's 556 months. So these are our initial findings. This is how we got to the data. This is the drug driving and property crimes. This is the specific UCR data that we took that information from. This on the bottom is the data for our supervised population, where I said we had a 0.9 increase through the last since 2019 until where we're at now at 2025. So just we wanted to make sure that as we made statements, they could refer to our data and know where we got that information from. Here is our JRP risk scores. So these are risk scores based only on the JRP crimes, right? JRP crimes, drug driving, and property crimes. You can see that the majority of the people that are going to the institution are high risk, but more of those high risk folks are coming to us on community supervision. When we're revoking people, we are revoking those people that have a high risk to recidivate. There are a few, I think we revoked 2 in 2023. Usually if it's a low-risk person being revoked, it's our office recommending revocation because there's new criminal activity attached to that. Now, some of those could be what Clint said. We may have gone in and requested that the person continue in the community, but there might be other factors that somebody else is looking at and request revocation.
Hey, Kiki?
Yes.
When I was 51, I could read this, but I just turned 52 and I can't read it anymore. So I'm wondering if you can email this out to everybody, or if you have printouts that people can, because I don't know if anybody else can see it, but I'm struggling on this.
I only made 10 copies in the interest of
Okay.
That again is the actual letter that went out that has the data, and then we'll send out the PowerPoint presentation. So just again, go back to those cases that have been diverted. And that's the cases and then people. When I say cases and people, it probably makes sense to you, but we have some people that have multiple cases that have downward departures. So we wanted to make sure we put body count in because that's what the prison counts as an intake, and then length of stay is based on the number of cases in the revocation period. I'm not a mathematician, so I used a calculator on this. And they don't call it prison dollar savings, they call it cost avoidance, right? Because we're avoiding the cost of sending somebody to prison. So based on my math, and somebody can correct me, I did use a calculator. In 2021, 2023, the Department of Corrections released a fact sheet report where they said that it costs an average of $140.87 per day to house somebody in an institution. Whereas, excuse me, it was $12.43 to keep them supervised in the community. If we've diverted 14,285 months, which equals 44,835 days over the last 5 years on first sentence probation revocations, keeping in mind first sentence probation revocations and short-term trans leave, it feels like that's about a 62,382,166.45 savings. Now I know that that's not really the way they do their math because I looked at the cost avoidance chart and I have a bunch of other things in there. But if you just look at dollar for dollar, day for day, Jackson County is doing what we need to be doing on justice reinvestment. We are diverting the right people, we are providing supervision to the right population, and revoking them when they're not successful under supervision. So this is sort of the argument that I'm going to attempt to make tomorrow in my 3 minutes of public testimony that I get before the Criminal Justice Commission. What have we done? How have we been able to be successful? These are the programs that have been funded through the Justice Reinvestment Program in the last 5 years. The ARC program was once funded, it's no longer. We no longer have pretrial, as I mentioned to you. But we do have a transitional care program that is very successful. You can see the numbers, and it's in some of that data, and we'll get this sent out to you. We have a resource center that has provided services. Our employment program is incredible. The Pathfinder Network is incredible in the amount of work that they do for us at all 3 of our locations with community justice. There's just a list of what those programs are. We proposed this new program because we found a gap in the service, and we thought we could fill the gap with these Justice Reinvestment dollars this next biennium. This requires us to hire some people. If we have 1 year of funding, and keep in mind the biennium started January 1st of 2023, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to be able to go forward with this program, because by the time you hire, train, we'll be nearly into our 2nd year. JRP in Jackson County has also funded equity services. We have a Voices of Lived Experience panel where we have people who have previously been under our care and supervision who provide us with information and about the best type of service, how we should provide service. It's a pretty strong group of folks that have previous experience both incarcerated and as an adult under supervision. We invested in equity, diversity, and inclusion training for all of our employees. We created an equity, diversity, and inclusion team using these JRP dollars. So we are doing what we need to be doing with this JRP funding. And as importantly, the victim services has been doing what they need to be doing. They're getting their 10% of this funding. And as you can see, the Children Advocacy Center just in 21-23 biennium provided 9,611 services that included 1,078 forensic interviews. Sad, but that's how much they've provided. And Community Works has a lethality assessment program, and you can see that they've had, 2019 to 21, they had 786 folks that received services, and 21-20 to 23, 587. Justice Reinvestment Program dollars are being spent appropriately in Jackson County, and we're spending those funds on the right people. So I know I'm trying to sing to the choir here, I think, but we're going to do our best tomorrow to provide enough information that they will hopefully fund us. I previously sat on the Criminal Justice Commission and the Grant Review Committee. It's been my experience historically that they don't change their mind once that recommendation goes from the Grant Review Committee to the Criminal Justice Commission, but we'll hope that we can get that. Jennifer?
For what it's worth, and I don't know if it's helpful with it at all, but as the CCO here, we are really supportive and have seen ways that you're trying to knit together and bring whatever other funds are available for these, and that this is the gap left. Welcome to say that.
Thank you. Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else have questions? Anyone see anything that didn't quite follow?
I had a question about the people that we have sent to prison. Was there did you do any data on those individuals that they might have questions about to see what they were going to prison for? And was there I know there was talk about that.
Yeah, we didn't look at the first sentences because we just don't have the time to look at all of those. We did look at the revocations, and as I mentioned before, the majority of those revocations where we were requesting revocation, there was a new crime attached, or there were significant technical violations attached.
I just wonder too, we're having to jump through quite a few hoops, it seems, to get funding from the state to not send people to prison, right? Yeah. I mean, is that summed up pretty well?
There's a lot of work involved.
Yeah, a lot of work involved. And I guess it's good, it's a lot of money, but sometimes I feel like, we tiptoe around for this money, and then at times these individuals are out potentially reoffending in our community. We don't have the jail space to hold them. At what point do we just say, you know what, the money's not worth it, send everybody upstate? And then, because if it's saving them $62 million, roughly, at what point do they say, okay, maybe we're making a good use of this money? And frankly, I don't know. I mean, to me,
that's just from our county.
I mean, they scrapped plans on building and opening two new prisons and then
Yeah,
stopped.
but I'm just saying, like, just for us in our community, at what point do we say, your money's not worth it? And figure a different way to do it and just say, we're sending everybody until you guys figure your stuff out up there. You know, if they're warranted, obviously, they go to the justice system. I don't know. It seems,
Well,
we have a high crime rate, we have one of the highest crime rates in the county and the state. We have one of the most significant high-risk offender populations in the state. We have a lot of other things that are contributing to our crime rates.
Well, and a lot of that also, I'll sing your mantra, it comes back to the fact that we don't have jail space either, because a lot of these people that we're keeping locally, if we could do 30, 60, 90-day sanctions, depending on what their structured sanctions allow for, that would probably have more impact on their willingness to be out there doing this kind of stuff. But we can give them, 2 days in jail or 3 days in jail and 20 days at the transition center, where the consequence isn't as significant.
Well, I mean, I would be happy to reduce prison usage by another 50% if we had a jail where we could have local sentencing here. I mean, that would be good too, but, I don't know if that's gonna be feasible in the next 5 to 8 years.
Maybe they can kick us back $60 million towards their jail.
The other thing is, I don't know if the other two counties have this, because we have, last I looked, I haven't looked recently, but we gotta be, same thing, we have the highest per capita number of high-risk offenders of any county in the state. So the fact that we have more per capita high-risk offenders means we're gonna have more people that fail at supervision, and they're more likely to reoffend than, especially Clackamas and Polk. I know Polk's pretty low. I don't know what Clackamas is, but, for us, that's a justification that I think I didn't see in your presentation, but, when they're comparing county against county, it might be a good add.
Well, under Measure 11 arrests, I mean, we had the second highest in the state.
Yeah, but committing a Measure 11 doesn't necessarily make you at a high risk to reoffend.
No, I know that. I'm just saying, if you look at just the sheer number, most of those, if they're convicted, would carry a prison sentence, right? I mean, that's how that works. If you're convicted of a Measure 11 offense, then prison bound. We have a high amount, and that doesn't mean every charge is filed by the DA's office, but it's certainly another metric that is weird, right? Like, we shouldn't be that high. We should be the sixth most if you look at the population.
Well, I think that you make a great point, and that's one of the Band-Aid approaches we're trying to take with this new program that we're creating. Because we have such a quick turnaround at the jail, we're pushing people in and out and not providing any opportunity to provide this case management piece of it. I think that if we had jail space, we would still want these positions, but certainly this creates a problem for us. And I agree with you. I mean, as a county, at what point do we say 3.8 million might not be worth the
69 million worth of jail beds.
Yeah. And again, I don't know what the folks on first sentences are going, but we know there's some that are coming to us on probation that perhaps shouldn't be coming to us on probation either, right? Because we're ending up in a revocation situation. So it'll be interesting. I appreciate all of your support, again, moving forward with this, and each person that provided the data to help us crunch the numbers. Ryan and Tira did a big, heavy lift the last few weeks on that, so I appreciate them. Any other questions? We'll send this, yes.
I'd just like to make an editorial comment. Both presentations today are Band-Aids that Jackson County is trying to remedy for problems that are state associated. That's what I'm witnessing right now. I really think that, those of us that have the ears of local representatives and local senators need to really be harping on them to come up with solutions at the state level that, instead of us throwing our good money after bad money that isn't being taken care of at that level, because it's exacerbated by the time we're trying to put a Band-Aid on that.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, once you present this, when do they give you their results?
About 45 minutes later.
It's almost like a parole hearing.
Yeah. 3 minutes.
45 minutes.
Three
So like we can.
No sleeping on it.
You could all get 3 minutes if you'd like 3 minutes. I don't know.
I think if you just went in there and said, fine, we'll just send them all to prison.
I can do that out of
Honestly, yeah.
All right.
I have an idea.
Kiki's like, whoa.
Maybe if we only get provisional funding and have to reapply and go through all of this process, it does keep us from getting, this other program, but maybe that's when we make the, okay, we've made the decision for us. But I am just one. Others may think differently. All right. Anybody have anything else?
Good luck.
Thank you. With that, do we want a round table? Does anyone have anything they'd like to report out from the quarter? Should we talk about the table?
Yeah, we got the preliminary stuff from DLR. It's really expensive. That's what I can say from our initial report. The needs assessment is updated, and based on the current numbers and trends, we need a little bit bigger than we needed before, which I guess is understandable. And that's projecting out 20 years. So the cost of what they believe would be the best solution, which was I think 850-ish beds, plus the treatment center is about 340 million, so about double what it was last time. So pretty expensive. And then
the last operating budget had 600 or 550 beds at no treatment center. And that was $1 billion over 20 years, including the capital outlay, so.
it's expensive. Yeah. So we're looking, they did include other options for us to explore and review, but I haven't had a chance to even meet. We just got it, I think, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. So I haven't had a chance to even meet with the commissioners or Danny or anybody on this. So it's just, and she said in her thing when she sent it, she said it's really expensive. So that was kind of the highlight of things. 400 beds, for instance, the treatment would be close to the same cost, a little more than, about 20 million more than it was to get our 800 bed to go last time. So 400 beds, and here it's 192 million. Estimated, of course, that's just their per square foot analysis, market costs. But they gave us a couple different options for sure to look at and explore, and there's some flexibility. So we'll start working on that ASAP.
Anything you'd like to share?
No, it's a lot of money. Travis, they said you can do that deal for 300 a square, right?
So done. Where do you want to start?
Anyone else have anything they'd like to report out to the group? This will be the last meeting before our end of the year. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your support.